Obviously, you've heard some introductions of our fantastic panelists who join me today, and all of us come from various different types of research institutes from across Canada. And of course, today we're going to be talking about the hot topic of the day, generative AI, but I think we bring a really unique perspective to that discussion because we sit between two worlds. We sit between the research world and the industry world, and I think all of us, not only are we committed to pursuing the research side of things, but we're doing that with the lens to productize that research at some point in the future. And so for today's panel, we're gonna talk about both sides of the coin. The opportunities, the positives, the exciting things that are ahead of us in terms of applications of generative AI. But of course, with every good thing comes risks and challenges. And so we're also gonna try to address some of those as well, thinking about not only how Gen AI could impact us from an industry perspective, but also thinking about potentially broader societal implications. And so I know we have 30 minutes on the clock, not very much time to get through a very meaty topic. And so with that, let's dive in. I will say beforehand a quick disclaimer that the opinions we're going to be sharing today are our own. They don't necessarily represent those of our organizations, and I say this behalf of all of our panelists. And so let's jump into things, starting with the positives, the opportunities. I think about generative AI both in terms of the low-hanging fruit, the things that are tangible today, but also in terms of where we're taking this for the future. And so let's start with the here and now. And maybe Sara, I'll throw this one to you to kick us off. What are some of the opportunities that you see on the horizon today that we can start leveraging within our organizations, and what are you most excited about?
I mean, I think it's just an exciting time to do research in this space because your research ideas, people have connected with them and want to use them in different ways. So, for example, our research lab, we work on models at scale, and perhaps it's been one of the most whirlwind years to be doing this type of research, particularly in language models, because I think what people have emotionally connected with is this idea that we can now generate fluid text that's persuasive. But I also think there's just an opportunity when that happens, when you have this timing where research automatically translates into impact, where two things happen. One, it gives a lot of resources for research, and I think that's important. But the second is that it also opens up new challenges. And so I think part of it, as someone who's running an industry research lab, is balancing the two. We make some research bets that are longer term, that are building, require, for example, a lot of infrastructure, like multilingual, but we're also balancing that with dedicated research efforts on, for example, how to make these models more efficient and more accessible. How can more people use them? Because right now, models at scale are only deployed in a few places, and that's because the infrastructure challenges are considerable.
Michel, you want to?
Yeah, maybe I could add also there's some very low-hanging fruit, very interesting opportunities in the sense of the technology being very new, being a bit immature in some cases. At the same time, there's staff shortages in many sectors. Let's think about call centers, for example. So you might not want to immediately jump to the solution where generative AI talks to an end user because it could, backfire. But then when you think of generative AI as a tool, one of the tools, of an experienced call center agent that has a problem with staff shortages in their team, then it could maybe accelerate some of the work. And those low-hanging fruits are a bit everywhere in different industries. So we have to be on the lookout for those and maybe use those opportunities that are maybe less risk, from a business perspective, but still interesting to advance and to evolve the tools while they're still a bit immature.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. I think the way that we're thinking about it is very much around enhancing the expertise that we already have within the organization and looking for those opportunities where we can test out the technology with a human in the loop, right? So you get that verification and you're managing some of the risks that are associated with that. Obviously, and I think, Sara, you alluded to this, things are very dynamic. It's almost on a daily basis that we're updating our opinions about where this technology is going to take us. And so really, who knows where we're going to be in the next 2 to 5 years. Maybe I'll throw this one to both Michel and Cameron. Would be really interested to get your perspectives on on where you think we'll be in the next 2-5 years. What are the things that you're most excited about in terms of those longer term opportunities that you think are on the table for us?
Well, in the long term, of course, the tools will keep evolving. So I guess we'll see more and more of those tools that enhance domain expertise. So we hear a lot about how, for example, a World Economic Forum analysis was saying that 40% of all hours worked in the U.S. So all sectors combined, 40% of hours worked in the U.S. would be affected in some way by AI, with the existing technology. When you think of that, we have to act, as a community in machine learning to make sure that we enhance and we take benefit of those technologies so that the society does not necessarily suffer from that. So that means a lot of training, a lot of human in the loop of the solutions. And the domain expertise, I think it's going to be valued more and more. So if I have to look at where we'll be in 2 to 5 years, I think we'll recognize that we've been neglecting a lot those employees who had the domain expertise of the companies, those that were doing the grunt work that we thought we would replace, and maybe even we would not need them anymore in companies. In fact, they're maybe the most important people. They have the knowledge of the domain expertise, they know the clients, they know their target audience. And the way we'll make use of their knowledge that's stored right now in their brains, might not be in our systems, and bring their knowledge, their domain expertise into generative models as augmented employees, I think will be something that's going to be very common. So that's my perspective on it.
So I think what's most exciting for me is computers historically have forced us to interact with them the way they work. And if you take a look at what prompt engineering has done and the large language models, is anybody can actually go on there and interact with it and do things. So I think that's incredibly exciting. I think the next part of that will actually be, if you take a look at historically, technology has been utilized by people to do more interesting things. There'll be new jobs in the future, so I think it'll be pretty interesting to see what comes out of that as well. So I do see a leverage point and be a productivity point. I think the big piece for me is going to be, how do you know the answers are trustworthy? Because it's a lot of work to actually understand it. So one of the companies we worked with the other day said he put in something fairly technical related to their field, and he asked for a source, so he looked up the source, and as it turns out, it was a fake URL that didn't exist. So you have to remember, a lot of these are text generators. They're not search engines, they're not truth, they don't create things that are true, and they can. But I think those are some of the pieces that if you take a look in the next 2 to 5 years, they have to be very good at the answers we get from them.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I'm going to table the risk side for just a moment. But I do think one of the points that you made was really interesting, this idea that now we have technology, very sophisticated technology, that's basically at the fingertips of pretty much anyone. And I think what we're already starting to see in the market is that tech can be productized pretty quickly. And so I'm really excited just to see the sheer kind of human creativity that's going to be built on top of some pretty sophisticated systems. And I guess that leads me to my next question, which is, I think generative AI creates this really incredible opportunity where we can bring together the research sector, and again, this kind of comes back to the point that, Sara, you made in terms of just the sheer speed of research finding its way into product and industry. And so maybe, Sara, I'll point this one to you. How do you think we can bring those two communities together, and what do you think the future is in terms of that type of collaboration?
I mean, I think there's a few aspects to this. Firstly, the skill set required to train large models is still very specialized. So there's a training aspect, and there's partnerships with academia. I also think the better question is not how research plays in industry, because I actually think research and industry is well set up to participate in this stage of innovation. I think the question is rather, how do we facilitate and bridge the gap for academic partners? How do we create national policies around compute where we support other areas that innovation can take place? Because as an industry lab, you already have access to a lot of compute. You can participate in contributions at scale. So these are aspects that I think are going to inform the discussion of, firstly, how do we attract the right talent, which is again reminiscent of early 2012, 2013, when you had a lot of lack of talent when convolutional neural networks came out because there were a few people who were specialized to train. Now it's a scale problem as much as it is an algorithmic problem. So how do you manage infrastructure and how do you do distributed training? In terms of the upside for industry labs to play is that I think that one role which is really important we preserve as industry labs is just sharing insights. I see this as a very precarious time for research in general. I think that labs where, for example, I was previously at Google Brain, now DeepMind, but there's just been a distinct change in the climate of being willing to share insights from industry research. And this is problematic for a few reasons. And I think that part of our commitment as a lab, Cohere for AI, is to continue to publish and to continue to share research. But this is one area where we really need to apply this societal value, even to research that's done within industry labs, that it be shared and bring in more researchers and collaborations with academia.
Cameron, Michel, anything to add to that one?
Yeah, definitely. I think the problems are still large enough and big enough that no one company can own this anyhow, right? So if you're not sharing it, you're actually limiting your growth. And so I think that's a critical piece is these are huge problems. I got in the field in 2008. There was the whole world in the AI space. You could go by first name globally because nobody was in it. So a bunch of these historical problems that were research problems are now industry problems. But the other part of this is there still is not enough talent. And if you don't share, you're not going to be able to accelerate and get to the point where you need to get to. So I think that's going to be absolutely critical.
So maybe moving on now to the fun stuff, the risks and the challenges. I'll put my risk manager hat on for a moment, and Cameron, I'm going to put you in the hot seat as a starting point. So obviously we know there's no free lunch, right? Anytime you have an opportunity, there's always got to be some fun challenge that joins it. And I think when it comes to generative AI, a lot of those challenges we're still very much working through. It's nascent, and we're figuring out as an industry and within our organizations in terms of how to deploy these technologies in a safe way. And I think a lot of that very much relates to the context in which we're deploying this tech and what use cases we're talking about, but very curious what your perspective is. How do we start to navigate some of these big challenges so that we can feel really good about the applications that we're starting to pursue?
So if I look at it from a macro level, we've used words ever since they've come out to start wars, look for peace, train people, encourage them, all these things. So this is now a faster way to do this. This is a way you can automate a bunch of these things. I would kind of liken it to a lot of people can remember when it was hard to use email because there was so much spam. But certainly, something like 85% of all email is still spam at this point in time. You don't see it because there's been systems that have been trained based on human data labeling and others say this is spam, it's not going to get through. So when you think about what has to happen is we still need human judgment. It's quite uncanny how much authority large language models can actually have with the way they answer questions. But I think there's still that judgment piece. I think the risk side has always been there. The speed in which you can do things is going to be faster. And that's the part I think concerns me more. Propaganda's existed forever. Now you can automate it. And so ultimately, I think the crown jewel in all this is actually going to be data. I think it's actually going to be this is correct data. And unfortunately, data is generally subject to interpretation and not actually to labeling what something is. Because somebody could call this a watch, somebody's going to call it a wristwatch, somebody's going to call it a Garmin. Those are all true, but there's no one of those things is more right than the other one. So I think there's a lot of challenges, but the data piece, I think, is how we go back to actually validate what you're getting out of the model is correct.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. And I think it's a really interesting, the output is very interesting in that we anthropomorphize it, right? And I think we give it a lot more authority than it should actually have in the end of the day. Like, this is a mathematical model that's providing some prediction about sentences that we're reading. And because it speaks to us in such a human way, I think we give it a lot more credit than it's actually due, at least where the technology is today. And obviously, there's been a lot of talk in the general media about not only risks in terms of applications within industry, but I think also these larger kind of broader societal and community questions around the ethical application of AI. Michel, this is a really hard question, but very, very curious about your views on moving forward. What are those major risks we should be looking at, and how do our communities come together to maybe start to mitigate some of that?
Yeah, so there are talks. There was one just recently between Professor Yeshua Benjo, our scientific director, and Professor Dr. Ururi about existential risk of AI for humanity. I think it's something we have to be mindful of. Certainly, one way for us to be mindful of that, a concrete way, is to keep up to date with credible sources of information. Also, like the World Economic Forum publishing, analysis on job loss and things like that. And I think we have to be mindful as practitioners, developing AI solutions like other sectors are. For example, biologists, that are studying viruses know that they're doing, their part of their work has some part of it is very dangerous for humanity. We went through a pandemic recently. Other like nuclear weapon, scientists know exactly what they're doing. I think for software engineers and all the scientists around AI, it's kind of new that we have to be mindful of our impact. But when you think of the impact on elections, for example, influencing an election through generative AI, spawning hundreds of thousands or millions of chatbots that could influence an election is something very real right now with generative AI that could happen today and would threaten democracy. So I think we have to be in a mindset of thinking of our perspective, the impact of what we do in terms of existential threat, unfortunately, and be very mindful and not do it alone. So basically, if you're advancing your organization in AI, in generative AI, try to have maybe an outside view from another organization, providing feedback. You might want to look up organizations like Obvia, OBVIA. Their whole mission is about societal impact of AI. At Mila, we have a full team dedicated to AI ethics. So you might want to get some outside opinion on where you're heading, so that we benefit from all the great benefits from generative AI, and we're mindful of existential. So that word, threat to humanity. Meanwhile, even if it's not something that's imminent.
Yeah, I think what you said really echoes a lot of what Sara was also mentioning before in terms of the importance of sharing, working together. I guess, Sara, you leading a research team, I'm very curious if you've seen changes in terms of the behavior of your research staff in thinking through how do we actually contribute to mitigating some of these risks?
Well, maybe I can throw a little bit of healthy kind of debate into the mix. So I think our field has really used this term existential risk a lot lately. My concern is mainly that it actually distracts from present-day challenges with these models. I don't think you have to go to the next generation of models to realize that these are powerful tools for good and for misuse. For example, multiple, Cameron, I think you pointed out first, this idea of misinformation. This is a real threat that we don't have to go to a next generation model to think about. So one thing I grapple with and try and anchor is that we need to invest as many resources in safeguarding our current models and thinking about risk, and perhaps that might actually be more precise than trying to talk about a future generation or future scenario. Because as humans, frankly, we're notoriously bad at predicting long-term time horizons. So part of what I'll throw in is maybe just a grumpy appeal is that I think that doomsday scenarios are quite sexy, and that's why they attract a lot of our attention, and that's why they're gripping as headlines. But the work that we have to do every day as technical practitioners is actually grapple with the impacts of our model today. And that's not new. There's been issues with bias and safety and propagation, so how models can amplify biases for a long time. What's different is the impact. So now our research ideas overnight are being deployed to millions of people. But this is more urgent. And so for me, this is one of the most compelling reasons to have resources. So in terms of how this impacts my research team, I think one thing that is exciting is that there's just more momentum between certain areas that are important. So for generative AI, for example, hallucinations, this ability to interpolate, because you're always returning an answer, has been a problem that's been known about for a while. But now we have more momentum in trying to understand what are mitigation techniques. This is an area where academic partners can also play a big role. Red teaming is super hacky right now. No one's doing it in a standard way. I mean, every company is doing it differently. Every academic lab is doing it differently. There's going to be more of a science behind red teaming. And also there's going to be more awareness of the limits of red teaming. I think those are areas where I see huge possibilities in how we build up technical contributions. But I'll pass on to Cameron. I'm kind of curious. Do you want to weigh in on this, Megs?
So I think the one really important piece you brought here was bias, and the bias actually comes from the data, right? Ultimately, that's where it starts. The models magnify it, just to be clear.
Yeah, okay, good.
So I think it's, again, I think we're dealing with similar challenges we have in the past, just the speed has changed dramatically. And so I think when it comes back to the effort of what needs to happen, it is more real-time safeguards versus, my analogy before was spam filters took years. And so how do you actually come back and do that in more real time? So I think there needs to be a balanced approach.
Yeah, I think I completely agree. I would say it's the speed, but also the potential scale. And I think we've already seen this with technology in, non-AI technologies in other places, right? Even with social media, there's the sheer impact that some of those things can have that are not necessarily by design, but are a byproduct. And so we all, I think, have to take responsibility as developers in thinking through what the potential impacts are and at least, start to work together to try to mitigate some of those risks. I don't know how much time we have left because the timer never went on. But if we do, if we have 30 minutes left, then I think we can take some questions from the audience. Oh, we have 3 minutes. So if there's any questions from the audience, happy to take them now. I had a hand shoot up over there.
Thank you. Oftentimes, crisis can be a starting point for regulation to come into an industry. And in AI, you have deep fakes, you have people impersonating each other and being very convincing. Do you see the industry as a whole paying as much attention to mitigating the crisis issues so that we don't have a regulation overhaul into the industry?
I didn't catch the very end of your question.
Do you see enough effort in the industry being put into, for example, mitigating those crisis scenarios, whether it's deepfake or other stuff, so that we don't have a regulation overhaul as often is the case when crisis actually happens?
Anyone want to take a stab at that one?
Yeah, sure. So I think when you take a look at it, think about an organization you want to deal with that's a company. Do you want to deal with somebody that you would consider untrustworthy or trustworthy? So I think there's a natural alignment to the outcomes you actually want from this. So legislation, again, if you look at traditionally how legislation comes out, you put a piece of legislation and then it gets proved out in the courts. That's generally problematic because it's not particularly quick. So I think they need to be fairly well thought through. If they're too restrictive, you can't actually do anything and you actually stifle innovation. So there's some balance. But I think as a whole, for industry, I think they are well aligned, or they should be well aligned with making sure they do the right things for their customers, because if they don't, they're going to end up losing their business in the longer term.
Completely agree.
I mean, I also think it depends on the mitigation techniques we have available. I think that, for deepfakes, for propagation of misinformation, those research areas are very nascent. People talk about watermarking. So watermarking is referred to as a technique to trace whether text is from a generative model or not, but it's very easy to circumvent. I mean, you can ask any college student. So these things have to happen in parallel. So I do think there has to be regulation for mainly, frankly, one of my big concerns is we lack traceability of how models are used. Like once a model is released, we don't know how it's used. We don't know where it's used. So there's that, but also I think that the mitigation techniques have to advance, and that has to be paired with an understanding of once we have enough confidence in the mitigation techniques, we can establish standards in terms of how those are used. But I see this as one of the most pressing research questions. How do we detect fakes. Right now, video fakes are not good, so it's pretty easy. Like, I know there's cherry-picked examples, but most are pretty bad. So that's okay, but it won't be okay for that long, so the research needs to get ahead of it. Watermarking, way too easy to circumvent. So how do we make that stronger, and what are the encryption standards for making that stronger? So if you're starting out on your research career or interested in these areas, these are very undersaturated areas to make contributions in.
And with that, I think we're likely at time. So I'm going to thank my fantastic panelists, and obviously thank you for joining us today.